The day I thought would be the happiest of my life became the moment I discovered what true family really means. My mother-in-law's cruel words at my wedding nearly broke me, but my 12-year-old daughter had a secret that would silence everyone in that room forever. You know that feeling when you're standing at the altar, surrounded by people who are supposed to love you, but instead you feel completely alone? That was me on September 15th, wearing what I thought was just a beautiful vintage wedding dress I'd found at a consignment shop. I had no idea I was about to become part of a story that would change everything I believed about worth, family, and the power of a mother's love. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm a 34-year-old nurse who works the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital here in Denver. After my divorce 3 years ago, I thought I'd never trust anyone enough to remarry. The divorce left me with nothing but debt and a broken heart, but it also gave me the most precious thing in my life: full custody of my daughter, Emma. Emma is 12 years old, but she's got the wisdom of someone who's lived through real hardship. She watched me work double shifts just to keep food on the table. She saw me skip meals so she could have seconds. She never complained when I had to miss school events because I was pulling another 16-hour shift at the hospital. Instead, she'd leave little notes in my lunch bag saying things like, "You're the strongest mom in the world, and I'm proud of you." When I met David Martinez, a physical therapist at the hospital, I wasn't looking for love. I was just trying to survive each day. David worked in the rehabilitation wing, and I'd see him every morning as my shift ended. He had this incredible way of talking to his patients, making them believe they could walk again even when they'd lost all hope. He was patient, kind, and somehow saw past my exhaustion to the person I used to be before life knocked me down. David fell in love with both me and Emma, which was non-negotiable for me. Any man who wanted to be with me had to understand that Emma and I were a package deal. David not only accepted that, he embraced it. He'd show up to Emma's soccer games, help her with math homework, and treat her like she was his own daughter. Emma started calling him Dad within 6 months, and I could see her blossoming under his attention. When David proposed last Christmas, Emma was more excited than I was. She immediately started planning our wedding with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. She'd stay up late creating elaborate plans in her notebook, using magazine cutouts from the hospital waiting room to design what she called the perfect fairy tale wedding. But there was one person who didn't share Emma's enthusiasm, and that was Patricia Martinez, David's mother. Patricia is a 58-year-old woman who owns 3 high-end boutiques in Cherry Creek, the wealthy part of Denver. She's never worked a real job in her life, married young to a successful businessman, and has spent the last 30 years measuring everyone's worth by their bank account and social connections. From the moment David introduced us at Sunday dinner, Patricia looked at me like I was something that had wandered in from the wrong side of town. She'd make comments about my humble profession and ask pointed questions about my financial situation. "David's been raised with certain expectations," she'd say with a smile that never reached her eyes. "I just want to make sure he's not settling for less than he deserves." David would laugh it off, telling me his mother was just protective and that she'd warm up to me eventually. But I could see the calculation in Patricia's eyes every time she looked at me. She saw a divorced nurse with no money, no connections, and no breeding. In her world, I was exactly the kind of woman who trapped successful men with false promises and pretty faces. The wedding planning became a constant source of tension. Patricia wanted a 5-star venue, designer everything, and a guest list that read like a who's who of Denver society. I wanted something simple, meaningful, and within our modest budget. Every suggestion I made was met with a condescending smile and a better alternative that cost 3 times as much. That's when Emma stepped in. She'd been quietly saving money for months, doing extra chores for neighbors, selling her artwork online, and collecting every birthday dollar from relatives. She told me she was working on a surprise for the wedding, something special that would make everything perfect. I assumed it was a heartfelt letter or maybe a piece of jewelry she'd saved up for. I had no idea that my brilliant daughter had been conducting research that would uncover a secret about my $200 consignment shop wedding dress, a secret that would leave 200 wedding guests speechless and change everything. Let me tell you how I ended up in that vintage wedding dress. because that story is just as important as what happened on my wedding day. After my divorce, I was drowning in debt. My ex-husband had left me with maxed-out credit cards and a mortgage I couldn't afford on a nurse's salary. I had to sell our house, move Emma and me into a tiny 2-bedroom apartment, and work every overtime shift I could get just to keep us afloat. For 3 years, I lived paycheck to paycheck. I bought Emma's clothes at thrift stores and made sure she never knew we were struggling. When she asked why we couldn't go to the movies anymore, I'd tell her we were saving money for something special. When she wondered why I ate cereal for dinner, I'd say I was trying a new diet. She was smart enough to know the truth, but she never called me out on it. Meeting David changed everything slowly. He started asking me to grab coffee after our shifts, and I'd have to explain that I couldn't afford it. Instead of making it awkward, he'd bring 2 cups from the hospital cafeteria, and we'd sit in the parking lot talking until the sun came up. He never made me feel ashamed about my financial situation. He just accepted it as part of who I was. David proposed to me in that same parking lot where we'd shared so many conversations. Nothing fancy, just him on one knee with a simple ring he'd saved up for months to buy. "Sarah," he said, "I don't care if we have to eat ramen for the rest of our lives. I want to build something real with you and Emma." I said yes through tears, not because of the ring, but because someone finally saw me as worth fighting for. Planning our wedding became my personal mission. I had saved exactly $3,000 over 8 months by picking up extra shifts and skipping every non-essential expense. David contributed another $2,000, and we were determined to make it work. I spent hours researching venues, comparing prices, and finding ways to make every dollar stretch. The dress was my biggest worry. I dreamed of wearing something beautiful, something that would make David's eyes light up when he saw me walking down the aisle. But wedding dresses in bridal shops started at $800 and went up from there. I couldn't justify spending a quarter of our budget on something I'd wear once. That's when Emma suggested we try the consignment shops downtown. "Mom," she said, "you always tell me that smart shopping is about finding treasures that other people overlook. Maybe someone's treasure is waiting for you." We spent 3 Saturdays going through every secondhand shop in Denver, and I was starting to lose hope. Then we walked into Second Chance's Bridal on South Broadway. The owner, Mrs. Rodriguez, was this sweet elderly woman who'd been collecting wedding dresses for 30 years. She took one look at me and said, "I have something in the back that might be perfect." She disappeared for 10 minutes and came back carrying the most beautiful dress I'd ever seen. It was ivory silk with delicate lace sleeves and tiny pearl buttons down the back. The moment I tried it on, I felt like a different person. It fit perfectly, like it had been made for me. The style was vintage but timeless, elegant but not overdone. Emma gasped when she saw me in it. "Mom, you look like a princess," she whispered. When Mrs. Rodriguez told me the price was $200, I almost cried right there in the dressing room. It was within my budget, and it was perfect. She told me it had been donated by an estate sale, and that the original owner had excellent taste. I paid for it that day, and Emma and I celebrated with ice cream cones from the shop next door. David's reaction when I described the dress was everything I'd hoped for. He said he couldn't wait to see me in it. Even Patricia, during one of our tense planning meetings, grudgingly admitted that vintage could be charming if done right. I thought I'd won a small victory. What I didn't know was that Emma had been paying attention to every detail about that dress. She'd noticed the quality of the fabric, the intricate beadwork, and the way Mrs. Rodriguez had handled it with such reverence. While I was focused on the price and how beautiful it made me feel, Emma was asking questions about where it came from and who had worn it before. 2 weeks before the wedding, Emma asked if she could spend the night at her friend Madison's house. I said yes, grateful for a quiet evening to address invitations. What I didn't know was that Emma had convinced Madison's mom to drive them back to Second Chance's Bridal that night. Emma had been researching something, and she needed to confirm her suspicions. That night changed everything, but I wouldn't find out until my wedding day just how much my daughter had discovered about the dress that would make me feel like royalty. The morning of my wedding, I woke up feeling like I was finally going to have the fairy tale ending I dreamed of. Emma had crawled into bed with me at dawn, something she hadn't done in years, and we lay there talking about how perfect the day was going to be. She seemed unusually excited about something, but I assumed it was just wedding day jitters. "Mom," she said, "today is going to be the most important day of your life. I promise you, everyone is going to see how amazing you are." There was something in her voice, a confidence that made me feel like maybe everything really was going to work out perfectly. I spent the morning getting ready with my bridesmaids at the hotel. My sister flew in from California, and my best friend from nursing school was there to help me with my hair and makeup. Everyone kept telling me how beautiful I looked, how the dress was perfect, how David was lucky to have me. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely confident about myself. But then Patricia showed up. She swept into the bridal suite like she owned the place, wearing a designer, mother-of-the-bride dress that probably cost more than my car. She looked me up and down with that familiar expression of barely concealed disapproval. "Well," she said, "I suppose you clean up nicely?" I tried to ignore the backhanded compliment and focus on the final preparations. My sister was helping me with my veil when Patricia made her move. She positioned herself right in front of me, making sure everyone in the room could hear what she was about to say. "Sarah, dear," she began, with that fake sweetness she always used, "I've been thinking about this wedding, and I realize I need to adjust my expectations." She paused, looking around the room to make sure she had everyone's attention. I mean, I gave her my son, and she couldn't even afford a proper dress. The room went dead silent. My sister's hands froze on my veil. My best friend stopped applying my lipstick. Everyone just stared at Patricia, then at me, waiting to see what would happen next. "Look at that thing," Patricia continued, gesturing at my beautiful dress like it was something she'd found in a dumpster. "It's probably older than she is." I tried to offer to buy her something appropriate, but she insisted on this vintage costume. She said the word vintage like it tasted bitter in her mouth. I felt my face burning with shame and anger. This was supposed to be my perfect day, and she was destroying it with her cruelty. I looked at myself in the mirror, and suddenly all I could see were the flaws, the slightly faded fabric, the tiny repair where a seam had been mended, the fact that someone else had worn this dress before me. "Patricia," my sister said firmly, "that's enough." But Patricia wasn't finished. "I'm just saying, when my friends ask about the wedding, I'll have to explain that we did our best with what we had to work with. David deserves better than this bargain basement production. But I suppose love makes people overlook certain limitations." I felt tears starting to form, but I refused to let her see me cry. I excused myself and went to find David, hoping he would defend me, hoping he would put his mother in her place and make this right. When I found David in the groom's suite, he was straightening his tie and joking with his groomsmen. "David," I said, pulling him aside, "I need to talk to you about your mother." I told him everything Patricia had said, watching his face carefully for his reaction. I expected anger, outrage, maybe even a threat to call off the wedding unless his mother apologized. Instead, David just laughed nervously and shook his head. "Mom's just old-fashioned, Sarah. She doesn't mean anything by it." He put his hands on my shoulders and looked at me like I was overreacting. "She's from a different generation. She thinks expensive means better, but we know that's not true, right?" "David, she humiliated me in front of everyone. She called our wedding a bargain basement production." "Look," he said, glancing back at his groomsmen who were pretending not to listen, "can we just get through today? Once we're married, things will be different. She'll come around. Let's not let her ruin our perfect day." His dismissive response felt like a second betrayal. Here I was, asking him to choose between his mother and his wife, and he was choosing the path of least resistance. He wasn't going to stand up for me. He wasn't going to defend our choices or our love. He was just going to laugh it off and hope it went away. I walked back to the bridal suite feeling more alone than I had in years. Emma was waiting for me with that mysterious box she'd been carrying around all morning. She took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "Mom, what happened?" "Nothing, sweetheart, just pre-wedding nerves." But Emma wasn't fooled. She'd grown up watching me put on a brave face when things were falling apart. She knew when I was lying to protect her. And in that moment, I saw something shift in her expression, a determination that reminded me of myself when I was fighting for our survival after the divorce. "Mom," she said quietly, "I think it's time to show everyone what I've been working on." Emma had been planning this moment for weeks, and I had no idea. While I was focused on seating charts and flower arrangements, my 12-year-old daughter had been conducting what I can only describe as a masterclass in detective work. It all started that night she asked to sleep over at Madison's house 2 weeks before the wedding. What actually happened was that Emma had convinced Madison's mom to drive them back to Second Chance's Bridal that evening. Emma had been thinking about our dress shopping trip for weeks, replaying every detail in her mind. She remembered how Mrs. Rodriguez had handled my dress with such care, how she'd called it special, and how she'd mentioned it came from an estate sale. Emma walked into that shop with a notebook full of questions and a determination that would have made any investigative journalist proud. She found Mrs. Rodriguez closing up for the day and asked if she could talk to her about the dress her mom had bought. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Emma had said, "my mom's wedding dress is beautiful, but I want to know more about it. You said it came from an estate sale. Do you remember whose estate?" Mrs. Rodriguez must have been charmed by Emma's curiosity because she invited her into the back room where she kept all her records. She pulled out a thick folder and started flipping through pages of documentation. "Let me see," she said. "Ah, yes, here it is. The Henderson estate sale from last spring." Emma wrote down every detail. The Henderson family had been prominent in Denver society for decades. When the elderly Mrs. Henderson passed away, her granddaughter had donated dozens of vintage pieces to various shops around the city. But this particular dress had come with something special, a folder of authentication papers and photographs. "Your mother's dress," Mrs. Rodriguez explained, "isn't just any vintage dress. According to these papers, it belonged to a private collection of haute couture pieces from the 1950s. The original owner was apparently quite the fashion enthusiast and had connections to Hollywood and European royalty." Emma's eyes widened as Mrs. Rodriguez showed her black and white photographs of the dress being worn at various glamorous events. There were authentication certificates, dry cleaning receipts from exclusive boutiques, and even a letter from a fashion historian who had examined the piece years earlier. But the real treasure was a small card tucked into the back of the folder. It was a thank you note written on expensive stationery, dated 1956. The note read, "Dearest Catherine, thank you for allowing me to borrow this exquisite gown for the charity gala. It was the perfect choice for such an important evening. With love and gratitude, Grace." Emma stared at that signature for a long time. Grace. Could it be? She asked Mrs. Rodriguez if she had internet access, and together they spent an hour researching the dress's provenance. What they discovered made Emma's heart race. The dress had indeed been worn by Grace Kelly to a charity gala in Monaco in 1956, shortly after she became Princess Grace. She had borrowed it from a wealthy American socialite who collected designer pieces. The authentication papers confirmed it was an original design by a famous European couturier, and the photographs showed Grace Kelly wearing the exact same dress at the event. Emma made Mrs. Rodriguez promise to keep the dress's history secret until the wedding day. She spent her saved money not on a gift for me, but on having the authentication papers professionally verified by a fashion historian in New York. She mailed copies of everything to an expert who confirmed what she already suspected. My $200 consignment shop dress was worth at least $15,000, possibly more. For 2 weeks, Emma carried this secret, watching Patricia make her cruel comments about my cheap dress and David's failure to defend me. She saw how Patricia's judgment was eating away at my confidence, and she knew she had the power to change everything. On the morning of the wedding, Emma carefully placed all the documentation in a beautiful box she'd decorated herself. She included the original authentication papers, the photographs of Grace Kelly wearing the dress, the expert's verification letter, and a typed summary of the dress's history that she'd written herself. But Emma's plan went beyond just revealing the dress's value. She understood that this moment was about more than money. It was about dignity, respect, and showing everyone that true worth isn't determined by price tags. She'd been practicing what she was going to say, rehearsing how she would present the information in a way that would make Patricia's cruelty backfire spectacularly. When I came back from my devastating conversation with David, Emma could see that I was close to breaking. She knew it was time to act. She asked Reverend Torres if she could have a moment before the ceremony to give me a special gift, and he agreed, thinking it was a sweet gesture from daughter to mother. Emma had no idea that her moment of truth would change not just my wedding day, but the entire dynamic of our new family. She just knew that someone had to stand up for me, and if the adults wouldn't do it, then she would. Standing there with that box in her hands, Emma was ready to show 200 wedding guests exactly who they were dealing with when they messed with her mother. The moment I started walking down the aisle, I could feel every pair of eyes on me. Patricia's friends were whispering behind their programs, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were all judging my bargain basement dress. My hands were trembling as I held my bouquet, and I was seriously considering turning around and running, but then I saw Emma standing at the front of the church with that mysterious box in her hands, and something about her expression gave me strength. She looked so confident, so determined, like she had a secret that was going to change everything. David was smiling at me from the altar, but I could still see the guilt in his eyes from our earlier conversation. As I reached the front of the church, Reverend Torres began the ceremony with his usual warm welcome to our families and friends. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Sarah and David," he said. "But before we begin, I understand that Emma has something special she'd like to share with her mother." I looked at Emma in surprise. This wasn't part of our rehearsal. She stepped forward with that beautifully decorated box, her voice clear and strong enough for the entire congregation to hear. "Mom," she said, "before you say your vows, I want everyone here to know something important. Can I show them what we bought last night?" The confusion on my face must have been obvious because Emma smiled and whispered, "Trust me, Mom. This is going to be perfect." She opened the box carefully, pulling out what looked like official documents and photographs. The church was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Patricia was sitting in the front row with a smug expression, probably thinking Emma was about to give some sweet speech about love and family. Emma held up a black and white photograph that looked like it was from a magazine. "Everyone," she announced, "I want you to meet my mom's dress." She paused for dramatic effect, and I could see people leaning forward in their seats. This dress was worn by Princess Grace Kelly to a royal charity gala in Monaco in 1956. The gasp that went through the church was audible. I felt my knees nearly buckle. What was Emma talking about? How could my $200 dress have anything to do with Grace Kelly? Emma pulled out an authentication certificate and held it up. "This document proves that my mom's dress is an original haute couture piece from the 1950s, worth approximately $15,000. It was donated to the consignment shop by mistake when someone didn't know what they had." I stared at my daughter in complete shock. The entire congregation was buzzing with amazement. I looked over at Patricia, and her face had gone completely white. Her mouth was hanging open, and for the first time since I'd known her, she was speechless. But Emma wasn't finished. She pulled out a thank you note written on expensive stationery and read it aloud. "Dearest Catherine, thank you for allowing me to borrow this exquisite gown for the charity gala. It was the perfect choice for such an important evening. With love and gratitude, Grace." The church erupted in whispers and gasps. People were taking pictures with their phones, pointing at my dress, looking at me like I was some kind of celebrity. I felt tears streaming down my face, but for the first time all day, they were tears of joy. Emma looked directly at Patricia when she delivered her final blow. "My mom taught me that it's not about how much money you spend, but about recognizing real value when you see it. She found something priceless that someone else didn't appreciate, just like David found her." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. David was staring at his mother with an expression I'd never seen before, disappointment mixed with something that looked like anger. Emma handed me a copy of the authentication papers. "Mom," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "you're not wearing a cheap dress. You're wearing a piece of history. You're wearing something that touched royalty, and you look absolutely beautiful in it." The congregation broke into spontaneous applause. People were standing up, clapping, some were even crying. I looked down at my dress with completely new eyes. This wasn't just a pretty vintage gown. It was a piece of fashion history, worn by one of the most elegant women who ever lived. David stepped forward and took my hands. For the first time that day, he looked me in the eyes and said, "Sarah, I am so sorry. You deserve so much better than how you've been treated today." Then he turned to his mother. "Mom, you owe my wife an apology, right now, in front of everyone." Patricia Martinez, who had spent months making me feel small and worthless, was forced to stand up in front of 200 people and admit she was wrong, and my brilliant, brave, incredible daughter had made it all possible with her love, her research, and her determination to show the world that her mother was worth defending. The aftermath of Emma's revelation was unlike anything I could have imagined. Patricia stood there for what felt like an eternity, her face cycling through emotions I'd never seen from her before: shock, embarrassment, and what might have been the first hint of genuine remorse. The entire congregation was still buzzing with excitement. Phones were out, capturing the moment, and I could hear people whispering about how incredible the whole story was. David stepped toward his mother, and his voice carried across the silent church. "Mom, you spent months telling everyone that Sarah wasn't good enough for our family. You made her feel ashamed of choices she should have been proud of. You owe her an apology, and you owe it to her now in front of everyone who heard you tear her down." Patricia's hands were shaking as she stood up. For a woman who had always controlled every room she entered, she looked completely lost. "Sarah," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I was wrong. I judged you based on things that don't matter, and I'm sorry." But Emma wasn't done. My brave daughter looked at Patricia with the kind of wisdom that comes from watching your mother struggle and fight for everything. "Mrs. Martinez," Emma said, "my mom works 16-hour shifts to take care of people. She saved lives while you were shopping. She raised me to be kind and smart and strong. The only person in this room who needs to prove their worth is you." The congregation erupted in applause again. I watched as Patricia's friends, the same women who had been whispering about my cheap dress, were now looking at her with embarrassment and disapproval. The tables had completely turned, and everyone could see who had really been acting poorly. But the most important transformation was in David. For the first time since I'd known him, he wasn't trying to keep the peace or avoid conflict. He was choosing me, defending me, making it clear that Emma and I were his priority. "Mom," he said firmly, "Sarah and Emma are my family now. If you can't treat them with respect, then you won't be part of our lives." The wedding ceremony continued, but everything had changed. When David and I exchanged vows, his words carried a weight they hadn't had before. "Sarah," he said, looking directly into my eyes, "I promise to always stand up for you, to never let anyone make you feel less than the incredible woman you are, and to never forget that true value comes from character, not bank accounts." During the reception, something magical happened. The story of the Grace Kelly dress spread through the crowd, and suddenly everyone wanted to hear more about how I'd found it, how Emma had discovered its history, and what it felt like to be wearing something once worn by royalty. I went from being the nurse who couldn't afford a proper dress to being the woman with the most fascinating wedding dress story anyone had ever heard. Mrs. Rodriguez from the consignment shop even showed up at the reception. Someone had called her with the news. She brought more photographs of the dress and additional documentation she'd forgotten to mention. Turns out Grace Kelly had worn my dress to 3 different high society events in Monaco, and there were magazine articles featuring it from the 1950s. But the real magic wasn't in the dress's history or its monetary value. It was in watching Emma beam with pride as people congratulated her on her detective work and her courage. It was seeing David finally understand what it meant to be a true partner. It was knowing that I had raised a daughter who would fight for what's right, no matter how intimidating the opposition. Patricia left the reception early, but not before approaching Emma one more time. I watched from across the room as my daughter listened to whatever Patricia was saying, then responded with the grace and maturity of someone twice her age. Later, Emma told me that Patricia had asked for her forgiveness and admitted she had learned something important about judging people. 6 months later, David and I received a handwritten letter from Patricia. She had enrolled in volunteer work at a local homeless shelter and written to tell us how much the experience had taught her about real struggles and genuine worth. She asked if she could take Emma and me to lunch, not to show off at some expensive restaurant, but to get to know us as people, rather than as threats to her social status. That wedding day taught me that sometimes the most precious things in life come disguised as ordinary treasures. My daughter showed me that real family defends each other, that intelligence and love are more powerful than money and status, and that dignity can't be bought. It can only be earned through how we treat others. Emma is 16 now, and she still has that authentication certificate framed in her bedroom. Not because of what the dress was worth, but because it represents the day she stood up for her mother and changed everything. And every time I look at that frame, I'm reminded that the most valuable thing I've ever owned isn't a vintage dress worn by royalty. It's the love and fierce loyalty of an extraordinary daughter who taught me what I was truly worth. So that's my story. The day my 12-year-old daughter taught me that true worth isn't measured by price tags, but by the love and courage we show for each other. Sometimes the most precious things in our lives are right in front of us, waiting to be recognized for what they really are. Emma is in college now, studying journalism, and she still has that investigative spirit that saved my wedding day. She recently told me that researching my dress taught her that every story has hidden layers, and that sometimes the most important truths are the ones people overlook. David and I just celebrated our 4th anniversary, and Patricia has become one of Emma's biggest supporters. Funny how life can surprise you. That vintage dress is hanging in Emma's closet now, waiting for her own special day. But honestly, it could never mean as much to anyone else as it meant to us on that September afternoon when my daughter showed a room full of people that their judgments were worthless, and that real family stands up for each other no matter what. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to remember their own worth. Have you ever had a moment when someone unexpected stood up for you? Or maybe you discovered that something you owned was more special than you realized? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of family, courage, and hidden treasures, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. I share real stories about real people who find strength in the most unexpected places. Because sometimes the best stories aren't found in movies or books. They're found in the lives of ordinary people doing extraordinary things for the people they love. Thanks for listening, and remember, you're worth more than you know.